They thought they could drag me off in fake handcuffs, but the second real badges stepped out of my truck, the hunters realized they'd just cornered themselves. The morning started quietly, almost deceptively so. A thin layer of fog clung to the lawns of Maplewood Estates, softening the edges of the rows of identical brick houses that lined the street. Birds were still half-heartedly chirping in the oaks that shaded the sidewalks, and the hum of sprinklers provided a steady background rhythm to the stillness. Malik Carter stepped out onto his porch with a steaming mug of coffee in hand, savoring a rare moment of calm before the day began. He had no reason to expect chaos, no warning that his life was about to shift in a way that would shake the entire neighborhood. Then he heard it, the roar of a truck engine, far too loud for this quiet cul-de-sac. Malik frowned and squinted down the street. A black SUV with tinted windows turned the corner sharply, followed by two more. They rolled to a stop right in front of his driveway, tires crunching against the asphalt. Before Malik could process what he was looking at, the doors slammed open and four men in dark tactical vests jumped out, their boots hitting the pavement in unison. "Hands where we can see them," one shouted, his voice echoing across the street. For a moment, Malik thought it was a prank. The men looked like a SWAT team, but the patches on their vests didn't bear any police insignia. Instead, the bold letters across the front read HOA Enforcement Division. Malik blinked. This had to be a joke, he thought, but the men were dead serious. "Sir, step away from the property," another barked, advancing toward him with a pair of handcuffs in hand. Malik didn't move. "What is this?" he asked, lowering his mug slightly. "Who are you people?" "You're in violation of Section 8, Article 14 of the Maplewood Estates bylaws," the first man said, as if reciting a law. "Unauthorized solar installation. You've ignored repeated notices. You're under HOA arrest, HOA arrest." Malik almost laughed at how absurd that sounded, but there was nothing funny about the cold metal fingers gripping his wrist a second later. "Hey, wait!" he protested, trying to pull back as one of the men twisted his arm behind his back. The sudden jolt of pain made him drop his coffee, the mug shattering against the driveway. Across the street, blinds shifted. Neighbors were watching, some with phones held up, recording, others peeking nervously from behind curtains. A few even laughed quietly, entertained by the drama. Malik scanned their faces, looking for anyone who might intervene. No one did. And then he saw him. Standing on the curb with his hands folded behind his back was Graham Whitaker, the self-appointed king of Maplewood Estates and president of the HOA. His hair was slicked back, his white polo shirt perfectly tucked into his pressed khakis. He watched the scene with the faintest hint of a smile curling at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't the smile of someone amused. It was the satisfied grin of a man who believed he had won. "I warned you, Carter," Graham called out, his tone dripping with mock disappointment. "Rules are rules. Maybe now you'll learn to follow them." "You've lost your mind, Graham," Malik shot back, grimacing as the fake enforcer shoved him toward the ground. "This isn't law enforcement." "You can't arrest people." "On the contrary," Graham replied, strolling closer, his hands clasped behind his back like a warden inspecting an inmate. "Our board has every right to enforce compliance. You signed the agreement when you moved in. You broke the rules. Now you face the consequences." The men forced Malik down to his knees, the gravel biting into his skin. One reached for a zip tie to secure his hands. Malik's heart pounded, not from fear but from anger. They think they can humiliate me. They think I'm powerless. He could feel every eye in the neighborhood on him, and Graham was loving every second of it. But Graham didn't know what Malik knew. "Listen carefully," Malik said, his voice steady despite the pressure on his arms. "You're going to regret this." One of the guards chuckled. "Is that a threat?" "No," Malik said calmly. "It's a promise." Down the street, a black pickup truck turned the corner, moving at a crawl. It wasn't unusual. Delivery trucks came through the neighborhood all the time, but Malik knew that truck. He recognized the subtle antennae on the roof, the unmarked plates, the way the driver scanned the street like a hawk as he approached. His chest tightened, not with dread, but with anticipation. "Get him cuffed," the lead guard ordered. "We'll escort him to the HOA office for processing." Processing. Malik almost smiled at the absurdity. These fools really believe they're cops. The truck slowed as it neared his driveway, and Graham turned his head, frowning. "Whose vehicle is that?" he demanded. "Probably one of Carter's little friends," one of the guards said, tightening the zip tie around Malik's wrists. "Doesn't matter." It did matter, because the moment the truck came to a full stop, the doors opened, and 4 men stepped out. They weren't in tactical vests or fake uniforms. They wore plain jackets, each bearing a discreet but unmistakable gold badge clipped to the front. Federal Marshals. The lead marshal, a tall man with a shaved head and a voice that carried authority, surveyed the scene with a frown. "What exactly is going on here?" he asked. Graham straightened his posture, clearing his throat. "This man is in violation of HOA regulations. We're conducting an enforcement action." The marshal's gaze snapped to the guard still gripping Malik's arm. "And you are?" "HOA Enforcement Division," the guard replied, puffing out his chest. "We're authorized." "You're authorized to do nothing," the marshal interrupted sharply, stepping closer. "You're impersonating law enforcement. That's a federal crime." The guard froze. We're private security. Private security doesn't put people in restraints on their own property," the marshal shot back. "And they don't claim to be conducting arrests." He turned to Malik. "Sir, are you injured?" "Just my pride," Malik said dryly. "But I'll live." The marshal nodded and gestured for one of his men to cut the zip ties. Malik rubbed his wrists as the plastic restraint snapped free. Around them, the neighborhood had gone eerily silent. Even the neighbors with their phones out seemed unsure whether to keep filming or back away. Graham took a step forward, his voice rising. "This is outrageous! He's the one violating community rules." "Community rules don't override federal law," the marshal replied, his tone icy. "And what I see here is a group of men illegally detaining a homeowner under the pretense of law enforcement." One of the guards began to stammer, trying to explain. Another quietly edged backward toward the SUV, clearly debating whether to make a run for it. Malik stood slowly, brushing off his knees. "You should have listened when I said you'd regret this," he said, his voice low but firm. "Because this is just the beginning." The marshal turned to him. "Would you like to press charges?" Malik glanced at Graham, whose once smug face had drained of color. The man looked less like a king now and more like a trapped animal. "Oh, I'm not done yet," Malik said. "But yes, start there." The marshals moved methodically, questioning each guard, taking photos of their uniforms, even confiscating the fake badges that had been pinned to their vests. The neighbors who had been laughing moments ago were now whispering nervously among themselves. Some of them, Malik noticed, were finally recording the right people. Graham tried one last desperate attempt to reclaim control. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The marshal didn't flinch. "No," he said, "you don't." As the SUVs carrying the disgraced guards rolled away, Malik remained on his driveway, hands in his pockets, staring down the man who had tried to humiliate him. Graham's confidence was cracked but not broken. Not yet. Malik could see the anger simmering behind his eyes, the certainty that he'd find another way to assert his control. And that was fine. Let him try. Because Malik wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was about to expose every crooked thing Graham had done, and this morning's stunt had just given him the opening he needed. The sun had fully risen now, washing the street in golden light. To anyone passing by, Maplewood Estates looked like any other quiet suburban neighborhood. But Malik knew better. A battle had begun on his driveway that morning, one Graham Whitaker thought he had already won. He had no idea that the ground beneath his feet was about to collapse. From the day Malik Carter moved into Maplewood Estates, he knew there was something off about Graham Whitaker. On the surface, Graham seemed like the picture of suburban respectability. Tall, always perfectly dressed in crisp polos and loafers, always smiling just enough to appear friendly. But there was a sharpness behind that smile, a calculating coldness in his eyes. It was the look of a man who thrived on control, a man who didn't just want authority. He needed it. Maplewood Estates had once been a peaceful, welcoming neighborhood, the kind of place where neighbors waved over fences and kids rode bikes down the middle of the street. That changed the day Graham seized the presidency of the HOA. It wasn't an election as much as a takeover. He rallied a small circle of loyal board members, men who owed him favors or feared his wrath, and pushed through a series of new bylaws under the guise of preserving property values. In reality, they were tools to tighten his grip on every inch of the neighborhood. Within weeks, everything started to change. He banned basketball hoops in driveways, calling them unsightly hazards. He fined a retired teacher for having a garden gnome visible from the sidewalk. He even forced a father to repaint his mailbox because it was, in Graham's words, 2 shades too blue for community standards. Malik had watched all of it with disbelief. "This is a neighborhood, not a military base," he'd said during one HOA meeting. Graham's response had been a thin, practiced smile. "Rules create order, Malik, and order protects property value. You do want your home to retain value, don't you?" That was Graham's favorite tactic, wrapping his tyranny in the language of responsibility. But beneath the polished words, his methods grew more ruthless. He began patrolling the streets daily, clipboard in hand, snapping photos of lawns and porches like a code inspector. He left violation notices taped to front doors without warning. He even had drones hovering above backyards under the pretense of monitoring compliance. Malik quickly became one of his favorite targets. It started with small things: a warning for leaving his trash cans out for 3 extra minutes, a $50 fine for a non-regulation wreath on his front door. Malik ignored most of it, refusing to play Graham's petty games. That refusal made him dangerous in Graham's eyes. "Carter thinks he's above the rules," Graham once muttered at a board meeting, not realizing Malik was within earshot. That kind of attitude spreads. If he doesn't learn his place, others might follow. From then on, the harassment intensified. One day, Malik came home to find a notice accusing him of violating the community's quiet hours. The time of the supposed incident, a weekend when he had been out of town visiting his brother. When he confronted Graham about it, the HOA president just shrugged. "Maybe someone used your property while you were gone," Graham said with feigned innocence. "Still your responsibility." Another time, Malik received a formal complaint about unauthorized gatherings in his backyard. The gathering in question was his teenage nephew and 2 friends playing catch. "You're creating a disturbance," Graham said during their next encounter, flipping through his clipboard as if reading sacred text. "We have elderly residents who deserve peace." "You mean Harold?" Malik replied dryly. "The man who plays drums in his garage every Sunday?" "Harold is on the board," Graham said, not even bothering to hide the double standard. "This conversation is over." But the final straw came the morning Malik installed solar panels on his roof. They were efficient, environmentally friendly, and well within county building codes. But they weren't on Graham's approved aesthetic list, which meant, in his eyes, they were an act of war. He showed up unannounced that afternoon, 2 board members in tow, and stared up at the panels with disdain. "This violates community standards," he declared. "Community standards don't trump state law," Malik countered. "And state law protects my right to install renewable energy." Graham's lips tightened. "We'll see about that." The next day, Malik received a $5,000 violation fine. When he refused to pay it, Graham escalated, filing fake complaints, leaving aggressive letters, and finally hiring private security to masquerade as HOA police and attempt the humiliating arrest Malik had endured on his driveway. But even as Graham's tactics grew more extreme, Malik noticed something interesting: desperation. There was a nervous edge to Graham's actions, a frantic need to crush dissent before it spread. It wasn't just about Malik. It was about maintaining the illusion of total control. Graham needed the neighborhood to fear him because fear kept them compliant. And Malik's refusal to bend threatened to break that illusion. Behind closed doors, Graham's paranoia deepened. At board meetings, he ranted about troublemakers and rebellious elements. He pushed for new bylaws granting the HOA broader authority, some of which were blatantly illegal. He ordered the board to monitor residents' social media accounts for disparaging remarks about the HOA. He even suggested requiring background checks for anyone who hosted a guest for more than 3 nights. One board member, a mild-mannered accountant named Lewis, dared to question the proposal. "Isn't that going too far, Graham?" he asked timidly. We're a homeowners association, not a police department. Graham's eyes turned cold. If you're not part of the solution, Lewis, he said quietly, then maybe you don't belong on this board. Lewis resigned a week later. No one else ever challenged Graham again. The more Graham tightened his grip, the more the community began to change. Neighbors stopped speaking to one another, afraid of being reported. Children played indoors instead of outside. Even simple things, like hanging holiday lights or hosting a barbecue, required written approval. Graham called it order. Most called it suffocating. Malik, however, refused to be cowed. He attended every meeting, challenged every unfair rule, and documented every instance of overreach. And each time he stood up, he saw the flicker of something dangerous in Graham's eyes. Not just anger, but fear. One night, as Malik was taking out the trash, he noticed a shadow lingering near his fence. He turned, and for a brief moment, he saw Graham standing there watching him. When their eyes met, Graham didn't speak. He just smiled, that same cold, knowing smile, and walked away. That was the night Malik realized this wasn't just about solar panels or noise complaints. Graham had made it personal. He wasn't trying to enforce order anymore. He was trying to break him. But Graham had underestimated the man he was dealing with. What Graham didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that every one of his illegal actions had already started forming a trail. Malik had been quietly building a record. The fake complaints, the threatening letters, even the drone footage hovering illegally over his backyard. Every piece of harassment was another thread in the noose Graham was unknowingly tying around his own neck. And while Graham strutted through the neighborhood like a king, certain of his throne, Malik was already laying the groundwork for a rebellion that would bring his empire crashing down. For now, though, Graham still believed himself untouchable. He believed the HOA bylaws made him sovereign, that his neighbors were too frightened or too complacent to stand against him. And as he sat in his office that night, reviewing violation reports with a self-satisfied grin, he had no idea that the storm brewing against him had already begun. Because kings fall hardest when they don't see the rebellion coming, and Graham Whitaker was about to learn just how far one man could go when pushed too far. The night after the staged arrest, the neighborhood felt different, heavier somehow, like the calm before a storm. Porch lights flickered on one by one as the sun dipped below the rooftops, but I stood in the dark by my living room window, staring at the street outside. Every sound seemed sharper than usual. A dog barking 2 houses down, the faint rumble of a car in the distance, the mechanical click of the streetlights powering on. I should have felt relieved that the fake cops had been exposed and left humiliated. Instead, I felt something deeper settling in my gut. Graham wasn't finished. I had underestimated his ego before. That mistake had cost me peace of mind. I wasn't about to make it again. A week passed in uneasy silence. Graham didn't show his face at the mailbox cluster like he usually did, and the daily barrage of violation notices stopped arriving. Neighbors whispered about the police incident they'd witnessed, some avoiding my gaze altogether, others giving me quiet nods of support. But beneath that surface calm, something felt off, like the air just before a thunderstorm, charged and waiting. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon, the storm broke. I had just stepped through my front door after work, the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the kitchen clock filling the quiet house. Then everything went black. Lights, appliances, all of it. My first thought was a simple outage, but when I stepped outside, the houses on either side were lit up as usual. My pulse quickened. I went around the side of the house to check the breaker box. What I saw made my stomach clench. The panel had been forced open and now hung slightly crooked, the metal edges scratched and bent. A heavy-duty padlock sealed it shut, and a bright orange tag flapped in the breeze. Notice unauthorized solar installation, service disconnected, by order of the Oak Ridge Estates, HOA. The bold HOA logo stamped at the top might as well have been Graham's signature. I felt heat rising in my chest, not just anger, but something colder and sharper. Tampering with a power connection wasn't just petty, it was dangerous. Illegal. Whoever had done this had risked causing a fire or worse, and the wording on the tag was nonsense. I didn't even have solar panels. This was sabotage, plain and simple. I snapped photos from every angle, making sure the lock, tag, and forced metal showed clearly. Then I walked slowly back inside, my mind already spinning. Graham had crossed a new line. He wasn't content with harassment or humiliation anymore. He wanted to make me suffer, push me into submission, or force me out entirely. But he'd just made the worst mistake of his life. The next blow came 2 days later. I was sorting through a small stack of mail at the kitchen counter when an envelope with the HOA's insignia slid out from the pile. At first, I thought it was another violation notice. It was worse. Final notice of lion and foreclosure proceedings, it read in large block letters. The letter claimed I owed $14,870 in accumulated violation fees, none of which had ever been mentioned in previous correspondence, and warned that if the balance wasn't paid within 30 days, the HOA would initiate foreclosure on my property. My hands tightened around the paper until it crumpled. Unbelievable, I muttered under my breath, pacing the kitchen. Graham wasn't even pretending anymore. He had manufactured fake charges, tampered with property, and now was trying to steal my home outright. But here's what he didn't know. I had been ready for this. Weeks earlier, after the fake arrest incident, I had started quietly documenting everything. Every violation letter was scanned and time-stamped. Every HOA meeting I attended was recorded. Cameras on my property, discreet but high definition, captured every time someone stepped onto my land. And they had been rolling the night someone tampered with my breaker box. I replayed the footage on my laptop. At 2:14 a.m., a dark SUV with its headlights off rolled slowly to a stop in front of my property. 2 men stepped out, one short and stocky, the other tall and broad-shouldered. I didn't need to see their faces to know one of them was Graham's enforcer, a board member named Lester who followed his orders like a soldier. The footage clearly showed them prying open the panel, slapping on the padlock, and driving away. Got you. I saved the file twice, once locally, once to a secure cloud drive, and then sat back, breathing deeply. The pieces were falling into place. Graham thought he was the hunter, tightening the net around me. But all along, he'd been walking right into a trap of his own making. 2 nights later, there was a knock at my door just after midnight. Hard. Impatient. I approached cautiously, glancing at the feed from the doorbell camera. 2 men in dark jackets stood outside, one of them flashing a badge against the glass. "Mr. Carter?" the taller one called out. "We need to speak with you regarding a code violation complaint." My jaw tightened. Code violation. At midnight. I opened the door just a few inches. "You're with the HOA?" The man on the left shifted uncomfortably. "Not exactly. We're independent contractors authorized by the board. We just need to do a quick inspection." "Come back with a warrant," I said flatly, and shut the door in their faces. For a moment there was silence. Then I heard one of them mutter, "He's not going to cooperate." Their footsteps faded, but I didn't relax until the SUV drove off. The audacity was staggering. Graham was now sending people to my home in the middle of the night, trying to provoke me into reacting. He wanted a confrontation, something he could twist into grounds for eviction or a legal complaint. Instead, he was giving me more evidence. I met with an attorney the next morning. "This isn't just harassment," he said after reviewing the documents and footage I'd compiled. "This is criminal tampering, fraud, and possibly attempted extortion. A homeowners association doesn't have the authority to cut utilities or file liens without due process." "I figured as much," I replied, "but I'm not ready to go public just yet. There's more coming. I can feel it." The attorney raised an eyebrow. "You're planning to let him dig deeper?" I nodded slowly. "Every shovel of dirt he throws is another piece of evidence I can use. And when it's time, I'll bury him with it." That more came sooner than I expected. A week later, I returned home to find a bright red notice posted on my door. "Final warning. Unapproved exterior alterations. Demolition order pending." Demolition of my property for an alteration that didn't exist. I stood on the porch, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the quiet street. Somewhere behind a row of hedges, I heard a shutter click. I looked up just in time to see Graham lowering a camera and walking briskly back toward his SUV. Smile for the evidence, I muttered under my breath, pulling my phone out to snap my own photo of the notice. That evening, I called Marcus, an old friend who now worked with the U.S. Marshals Service. We hadn't spoken in months, but I knew I could trust him. "Marcus, I need a favor," I said after explaining the situation. "I think I'm dealing with something more than an HOA overreach. There's fraud, sabotage, maybe even a conspiracy." On the other end of the line, Marcus was silent for a moment. Then his voice came low and serious. "If half of what you're saying is true, this isn't a civil matter anymore. Document everything. Don't confront him directly. Let me make a few calls." "Thanks," I said, the weight of the past weeks pressing on my chest. "Because he thinks he's untouchable." "They all do," Marcus replied, "right up until the cuffs go on." That night I sat by the window again, watching Graham's house across the street. His lights were on late, and I could see silhouettes moving through his office. Somewhere in there, he was probably drafting another bogus notice, another threat meant to break me. But it was too late for that. Every move he made, every forged document, every tampering incident, every phony lien, was now part of a growing case file. And thanks to Marcus, that file was already circulating in places Graham couldn't reach. The county prosecutor's office, the state attorney's office, even a contact in the federal housing division. The truth was, Graham hadn't broken me. Not even close. All he'd done was tighten the noose he was building. And soon he'd discover he was the one standing at the end of it. Because Graham believed he'd broken me. In reality, he had just built the noose he was going to hang himself with. The morning after the bogus demolition notice appeared on my door, I woke before sunrise with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. The fear, the frustration, the sleepless nights replaying Graham's threats in my mind, all of it hardened into resolve. Graham believed he was tightening a chokehold around me. What he didn't realize was that every move he made had become a piece of evidence, every attempt to intimidate me another nail in the coffin he was building for himself. From that day on, my home stopped being just a place to live. It became a war room. I cleared the long oak dining table of everything but my laptop, a thick stack of folders, and a legal pad already half filled with notes. Each morning before work and every night before bed, I spent hours sorting, labeling, and cross-referencing. A corkboard on the wall grew crowded with printed emails, photos from security cameras, violation notices, and copies of HOA bylaws that Graham had flagrantly ignored. Red string began to stretch between events, the fake arrest, the power tampering, the fraudulent lien, all pointing back to one man, Graham. But evidence alone wasn't enough. I needed structure. I needed a case. The first step was organizing the footage. My exterior cameras had caught nearly everything. Graham's guards trespassing on my property in the dead of night, Lester prying open the breaker box, even a board member sliding a notice under my door at 3 a.m. while looking over his shoulder like a burglar. I watched each clip carefully, jotting timestamps and context into a growing log. March 17th, 2:14 a.m. Panel tampering by Lester and unidentified second man. April 2nd, 12:06 a.m. Unauthorized inspection attempt by two men in dark SUV. Hours blurred into days as I pieced the puzzle together. Every detail mattered. The license plate numbers I could zoom in and read, the HOA branded tag they foolishly left on the breaker box, even Lester's reflection in my front window revealing his face more clearly than he realized. When I finally leaned back from the screen, I knew I had something solid. Not just proof of harassment, but evidence of coordinated criminal activity. Emails were next. Most homeowners probably deleted Graham's messages without a second thought. I archived every single one. Some were the usual boilerplate about community standards and fee adjustments, but others were far more revealing. One message, sent just a day after the power tampering incident, read, "If you choose to ignore HOA directives, expect consequences. The board has broad authority to enforce compliance." Another, more careless one from a board member said, "We handled the solar issue just like Graham wanted." That'll teach him to mouth off at meetings. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Just like Graham wanted, it was the smoking gun, a written admission that the power cut wasn't an accident or a utility issue. It was retaliation, carried out under his orders. I printed it twice and highlighted the key lines in yellow. This was no longer a story about a petty HOA president. It was a story about abuse of power, and now I could prove it. But perhaps the most powerful weapon I gathered didn't come from my cameras or my inbox. It came from the people Graham had stepped on. I started with Marcus, my neighbor 2 doors down, whose teenage son had once been fined for leaving his basketball hoop out overnight. He had paid hundreds in penalties and eventually stopped speaking up at meetings. When I approached him one evening as he watered his lawn, he looked hesitant at first. "I don't want to get involved," he muttered, glancing nervously toward Graham's house across the street. "I get it," I said, lowering my voice. "But I'm putting together a case, a real one. If you've ever been threatened or overcharged, your testimony could make the difference." He stood there for a long moment, the water from the hose darkening the grass at his feet. Then he sighed. "All right, I'll talk one by one." Others followed. An elderly man named Howard confessed that Graham had threatened to foreclose on his home over a missing fence post. A young couple revealed that they had been pressured into signing over access to part of their yard for a community improvement project that never materialized. All of them were afraid. All of them had stories. I documented each account and had them sign sworn affidavits. By the end of the week, I had over a dozen statements, a chorus of voices that painted a picture of Graham's reign far more damning than anything I could present alone. The deeper I dug, the more I realized how wide Graham's net reached. He wasn't just enforcing bylaws. He was misusing funds, coercing homeowners, and in some cases impersonating law enforcement. That last one was crucial, because 2 of my closest friends, Tom and Ray, were deputy marshals, and as it turned out, they were already working on a task force investigating corruption among homeowner associations in the region. When I met them in a quiet corner booth of a diner just outside town, Tom leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Everything you're describing, false lines, impersonation, misuse of funds, we've seen it before, and it always ends the same way. Someone gets greedy and sloppy." "Graham's already both," I said, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were copies of my footage, emails, and affidavits. Ray flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing. "This is more than enough for a federal inquiry. But if you really want to finish this, we need him to act again. On record." In person, a slow smile crept across my face. I can make that happen. The plan that took shape over the next few days was simple but risky. I drafted a formal refusal to pay the fraudulent lien and mailed it via certified letter directly to the HOA office. I knew Graham well enough to predict what he'd do next. He wouldn't ignore a challenge. His ego wouldn't allow it. And sure enough, within 3 days, I received a curt email. "Failure to comply will result in immediate enforcement action, including seizure of property as permitted under the HOA's bylaws." It was exactly the reaction I'd hoped for. We set the trap for a Saturday morning, the day Graham usually made his rounds of the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, like a self-appointed king inspecting his domain. Tom and Ray parked an unmarked vehicle down the street, blending in with weekend traffic. Cameras were rolling from multiple angles, my porch camera, a secondary hidden camera on a tree across the street, and a third positioned by Marcus, who had volunteered to help. All we had to do was wait. The morning air was cool and still, but my heart pounded like a drum as the minutes crawled by. At precisely 9:03 a.m., a familiar white SUV rolled around the corner and stopped in front of my driveway. Graham stepped out, wearing his usual khaki pants and navy polo, a smug smile plastered across his face. Behind him, Lester and another board member carried stacks of paperwork and what looked disturbingly like padlocks and chains. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, keeping my expression neutral. "Morning, Graham," I said evenly. "Morning," he replied, his voice syrupy with false politeness. "We're here to enforce the lien you've chosen to ignore." "I didn't ignore it," I said. "I rejected it because it's fraudulent." He chuckled, shaking his head like I was a misbehaving child. "The board has already voted. We're within our rights to seize the property until the balance is paid." "Seize?" I repeated. "As in trespass and unlawfully enter a private residence?" Lester stepped forward, brandishing a document. "This authorizes us to do absolutely nothing. A new voice cut in. Tom and Ray were walking up the sidewalk, badges in hand, their expressions stone cold. Graham's smile faltered for the first time. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice suddenly less confident. "Yes," Tom said. "We're deputy marshals. And we're very interested in this seizure you're talking about. Maybe you can explain it downtown." Ray took the papers from Lester's hand, scanning them. "This isn't a legal lien, and this isn't a lawful order. What it is," he said, looking up sharply, "is evidence." The color drained from Graham's face. I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Funny," Tom interrupted. "We were thinking the same thing. About impersonating law enforcement, about fraud, about tampering with utilities. Should I go on?" For a long, heavy moment, no one spoke. Graham's hands twitched at his sides, his carefully crafted mask of authority slipping as reality began to close in. He had walked straight into the trap, just as I knew he would. That night, I sat alone in my living room, the adrenaline finally fading. My house was quiet, the power humming steadily, the breaker box locked and secure. By me this time. It wasn't over yet, not by a long shot, but for the first time in months, I felt the balance shift. The man who had terrorized the neighborhood for years was no longer untouchable, and this time, it wouldn't be me answering for false accusations or bogus fines. Because while Graham strutted around the neighborhood bragging about how he handled me, I was putting together a case that would dismantle everything he'd built. The air inside the Oak Ridge clubhouse felt different that night, charged, heavy, and waiting to explode. The folding chairs were packed shoulder to shoulder, every one of them filled with residents whispering anxiously to their neighbors. Local news crews were lined up along the back wall, their cameras already rolling. A few city officials had even shown up, seated stiffly in the front row, their expressions unreadable. It wasn't just another HOA board meeting. Everyone in that room knew something was about to happen, even if they didn't yet know what. Graham strolled in a few minutes late, as usual, a smug smile fixed on his face. He wore his favorite navy blazer and gold HOA pin, the kind of outfit meant to remind everyone he was in charge. He paused at the door to let the cameras catch him, straightened his jacket, and walked down the center aisle like a man arriving at his own coronation. He was expecting another easy night of issuing fines, barking orders, and humiliating anyone who dared stand up to him, and that included me. He spotted me near the front and smirked, leaning over the table to whisper something to one of his board members that made them both laugh. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, my face calm. Inside, though, my heart was hammering. This was it. Months of planning, weeks of digging through evidence, and one dangerous night of gathering proof. It all came down to this moment. Graham banged his gavel on the table, signaling the start of the meeting. "All right, folks," he said, his voice loud and cheerful. "Let's get this circus started. We've got a long list of violations to discuss tonight, including a few repeat offenders." A few people chuckled nervously. Others shifted uncomfortably. Graham loved calling me a repeat offender. It was his favorite insult. "First up," he said, flipping through his papers with a theatrical sigh, "is Mr. Carter, who still hasn't paid the $12,000 in fines we've issued for his unauthorized solar panels." He turned toward me with a wolfish smile. "Mr. Carter, care to explain why you think you're above the rules the rest of us live by?" I rose slowly from my seat. Every eye in the room followed me as I walked to the podium, a small black binder tucked under my arm. Graham leaned back in his chair, hands behind his head, already savoring the speech he thought I was about to give, the one where I begged for leniency. But tonight, the script wasn't his to write. "Before we talk about solar panels," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I think the community deserves to see something." I opened the binder and pulled out a small remote. A projector hummed to life behind me, casting a bright rectangle of light onto the screen at the front of the room. The first video began to play. It was grainy but clear enough. Two of Graham's private security guards, standing at the edge of my property line, shouting threats. One of them drew his weapon and pointed it at me. The other shoved me to the ground. The footage cut to them trespassing on my property, then back to me on the ground as they tried to handcuff me. Gasps rippled through the room. Even the reporters lowered their cameras for a moment, stunned by what they were seeing. That, I said, clicking the remote again, happened right outside my home. I was never charged with a crime. I never even received an explanation. And those men, I pointed to the screen, were hired and authorized by this board. Graham laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it now. "Oh, come on," he scoffed, waving a hand. "That's out of context." My security team was acting in the best interest of the neighborhood. I ignored him and clicked again. The second video appeared, the night my house went dark. It showed two men in uniforms tampering with the electrical box on the side of my property. They cut the main line, then drove away without a word. Murmurs grew louder. Someone in the back shouted, "Is that even legal?" Another asked, "Who gave that order?" "This wasn't an accident," I continued. "It was retaliation. And I have proof of that, too." The screen filled with emails, dozens of them. They were all from Graham. In one, he wrote about teaching Carter a lesson. In another, he instructed his team to make an example of me so others would stay quiet. And in one particularly damning message, he discussed how much money the board could make by fining me until I broke. All the color drained from Graham's face. He shot to his feet. "This is nonsense," he shouted, his voice cracking. "This is fake, doctored, whatever you want to call it." "Actually," said a calm voice from the back of the room, "it's evidence." The crowd turned. A man in plain clothes was standing now, a badge held out for all to see. Two more roses beside him. "Federal Marshals," the lead agent said. "Graham Holt, you are under arrest for impersonation of law enforcement, extortion, property sabotage, and wire fraud." The room erupted into chaos. Graham stumbled backward, his face ghost white. "What? No, this is insane. I'm the president of this association. I run this neighborhood." "You ran this neighborhood," the marshal replied, stepping forward as two others moved behind Graham. "And now you're done." The same guards who had once tried to handcuff me were suddenly on their knees, real handcuffs clicking around their wrists. Residents shouted questions. Reporters surged forward. Graham twisted and shouted for his lawyer, for the board, for anyone, but no one moved. "Someone stop them," he yelled, but the board members were silent, their faces pale and terrified. As they led him past me, his eyes locked on mine, full of fury, confusion, and fear. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The sound of the cuffs said everything. The meeting ended in chaos, but the fallout had only begun. Over the next few weeks, the investigation widened far beyond Graham's behavior toward me. Federal auditors uncovered embezzlement schemes, falsified complaints, and illegal contracts stretching back years. Board members resigned in disgrace. Properties seized under false pretenses were returned to their rightful owners. And then, the news that sealed Graham's fate. Several of his own associates had agreed to testify against him. The HOA dissolved under federal order. Its bank accounts were frozen. Every document, every contract, every decision was placed under review. The neighborhood that Graham had ruled like a personal kingdom was now under federal oversight. The day his sentence was announced, 7 years in federal prison, I stood on my front porch and watched as workers installed a new row of solar panels across my roof. The hum of restored power filled the air. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, free. I thought about the night they tried to handcuff me, about the threats and the humiliation and the fear. And then I thought about this night, the one where justice had finally arrived. The HOA tried to handcuff me. They never imagined the one stepping out of my truck would be the men to handcuff them. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of abuse of authority, unlawful detention, and the severe consequences of vigilantism and impersonation of federal law enforcement. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of dignity and accountability, showing that illegally challenging an individual can lead to immediate federal intervention.